stops. So everyone knows that this event will be recorded and we put onto the ESRC's YouTube channel, where tonight's discussion can be viewed again at your own leisure. Welcome along this evening or this morning or wherever you may be joining us from. It's great for you to be here. My name is Paul Kitchen. I am the head of school, the School of Sport at Ulster University here in Belfast and Magee in Derry. And there's a bit of a background to who we are. The School of Sport has over 500 students studying sport-related programs across Northern Ireland. And we have a Sport and Exercise Sciences Research Centre, which has a long history in public health research. Recently, we have moved into this gambling space, looking to look at public health approaches to gambling and reduction of gambling harm. And as head of school, I must declare that my work receives no support from any individual organisation associated from the gambling industry. So why we're here tonight, you're very welcome again, but we're aiming to explore how the social sciences can reduce gambling harm and add value to sort of debates around the gamblification of sport, the normalisation of gambling in sport, if we will. In particular, we're going to look at this notion of critical qualitative inquiry in order to enhance our sort of understanding of the impact of gambling marketing, both locally and internationally. And we're joined by a great panel this evening. So what do I mean by that? Well, we'll obviously get into much more detail about critical qualitative inquiry as we go through the seminar today, and I want to keep this intro fairly brief. But positions our focus as researchers and advocates around gambling marketing and the impact of gambling marketing on various peoples, to explore things like how power relations work, who's making decisions and whose benefit those decisions are made for. So it allows us to sort of critique the policy making process around regulation of gambling. And for those based in Britain today or yesterday, you may have seen a piece by Rob Davies in the Guardian newspaper from London around the 28 MPs in British Parliament and their associations in dealing with gambling related companies, showing that a number of politicians are working on behalf of gambling companies, but also receiving entertainment packages from gambling companies to go along to sporting events and sometimes exclusive sporting events. So join me on this panel this evening to discuss these issues in greater depth. I'm going to make a quick introduction to them now. And first of all, I'd like to introduce my PhD researcher from our doctoral college at Ulster University, and really Ms. Erin McEvoy is going to provide us with an overview of her ongoing research into women's experiences of gambling and gambling harm and the marketing of gambling. And she's going to give us a brief presentation to start things off today. Following that, we'll have a panel discussion, and I'm delighted to be joined by Professor Samantha Thomas, who's joining us from Melbourne, Australia this morning, up early. So thank you, Samantha, for that. Professor Thomas is a professor of public health at Deakin University, the Institute of Health Transformations, and one of the world's leading academics on gambling, marketing, and public health. We're also joined by Dr. Crystal Fulton from UCD in Dublin as a researcher in information behaviour in everyday settings. And obviously, Dr. Fulton was lead investigator in researching the impact of gambling on individuals and society in Ireland, which has informed the Department of Justice and Equality's input into legislation around gambling. Also, pleasure to introduce Mr. Barry Grant from the social justice charity Extern, formerly the CEO of Problem Gambling Ireland. Barry is a counsellor for those experiencing gambling harm and creator of the Problem Gambling podcast. And finally, I'd like to introduce Mr. James Grimes, who is the founder of The Big Step, which is a campaign to raise awareness around the involvement of gambling marketing in the sport of football, and it's, if you will, gamblification of the game. James is an expert with experience aiming to make sport more aware of the risk of its dependency on gambling revenue. So you're all very welcome here tonight, this morning, wherever you might be. And what I would just say is a plan of attack for this evening. Following Erin's presentation, I'm going to throw over to the panel, and these queries and questions will be led by myself as MC. And if you have questions, you may ask them along the way using the Q&A panel. You pass the question there. And as moderator, what I will try and do is fit those questions into the discussion rather than stop discussion to ask a standard question. So try and manage the panel discussion as we go. But the beauty of Zoom, if you will, is we can actually, wherever you're sitting from, input these questions as we're speaking, and they will fit into the discussion and can form part of the discussion as well, rather than fearing you have to stop the discussion and go back on a point. We can incorporate them in. So one more time, thank you very much for being here. And I'd just like to throw over to Miss Erin McEvoy for an overview very much of the context of women's gambling marketing, and very much a context of the island of Ireland, two regions. So Erin.
Thanks, Paul. I'm just going to share my screen with you all now. Hopefully you're able to see this. Well, just to continue on from what Paul has said, you're all very welcome here today. I just want to give a good morning or good evening to you, dependent on where you are in the world. I know we have a number of international visitors here today. Today, this webinar is entitled When the Fun Stops. So we're really going to look at how the social sciences can add value to the ongoing debate of gambling-related harms. So just before we begin, I would like to start with a little bit of housekeeping. So for those of you who aren't familiar with me, my name is Erin McEvoy. I am a PhD researcher at the Ulster School of Sport, and I'm currently in my third year looking at gambling marketing and its impacts. I would like to make clear that I have no conflicts of interest to declare prior to this webinar today, and I've also received no funding from any industry-related sources. Finally, my PhD has been funded by the Department for Economy. And I'd like to pass a thanks on to Dr. Paul Kitchen for organising this webinar today, and to our international panel for joining us today. And I'm looking forward to the discussion after my presentation. So when we look at gambling has been so naturally ingrained and normalized within our society that we have all come across it at some point or some stage in our lives. Now, when we think of how to gamble or the types of gambling, stereotypically we refer to things like visiting a casino, going to the bookies, or playing on slot machines. You can gamble as easily as taking part in poker with your friends on a Friday night for money. You can also take part by purchasing a ticket during a Christmas raffle, or something as simple as purchasing a scratch card with your groceries at the end of the week. Globally now, by 2023, gambling is estimated to be worth $525 billion, and evidently this figure will continue to increase. So let's take a closer look at Northern Ireland. So at present, we have a very, very small amount of research which has included Northern Ireland in the context of gambling prevalence. So our background to protecting those vulnerable from gambling harms is outdated, with current legislation dating back to 1985. However, this is currently under review. In addition to this, we also have an absence of large-scale research. So for example, Northern Ireland has not been included in the gambling prevalence survey so far. However, we do have two small research publications, the NI Gambling Prevalence Survey, which was published in 2010 and 2016. And from this, we've been able to get some interesting insights so far. One of these is that the gambling addiction prevalence amongst NI citizens is around 2.3%. Now, this equates to roughly around 40,000 people. And of the individuals included within the survey, 4.9% of those were indicated to be at a moderate risk of developing a gambling addiction in the future. Now, in terms of the gambling addiction prevalence rate, this is significantly higher than our counterparts across the water. I mean, when we look at England, it sits at 0.5%, Scotland sits at 0.7%, and Wales at 1.1%. It's clearly evident that we do have a very high gambling addiction prevalence rate. Now, when we also look at protecting NI citizens, the Gambling Commission has no jurisdiction across Northern Ireland. So when we combine these mentioned factors and an absence of NHS-funded treatments for those with gambling addictions, due to the fact that it's not yet viewed as a public health issue here, we inevitably are adding to the complexities and issues surrounding gambling addictions for NI citizens. Now let's take a look at Northern Ireland. So again, like Northern Ireland, Ireland also has an absence of research, and several estimates currently indicate that there's a 0.8% prevalence of gambling addiction amongst Irish citizens, and this is estimated to work out around 40 to 50,000 people. Now, it should be noted that the data that this came from was a study conducted in 2014-15, which wasn't published until 2019, and therefore may fail to accurately represent Ireland as of 2021. Again, then there's a significant level of outdated legislation. Now, there has been some movement with this, with the current implementation of the Gaming and Lotteries Act 2019 as of December 2020. However, much more work is needed to protect those from gambling-related harms. And this naturally leads me to my next point, which is as of 2021, Ireland does not have a gambling regulator or gambling commission, although several discussions have been ongoing about the potential implementation of one in the future. So continuing on, qualitative research can contribute significant benefits to the social sciences, and it's particularly relevant when exploring sensitive issues like addictions. So some of the benefits research in this context can enable is a holistic understanding of addiction. It also enables the lived realities of people involved in research to be uncovered and provides a really detailed insight into sensitive issues that are difficult to represent through quantification. Now, when we take a critical approach to this type of research, we're able to do something really important. We can do things like address inequalities in our society. We also enable experts by experience to voice their truth and lived experiences of what they've been through. And in addition, it can also help when exploring social issues in our society, such as gambling addictions. So on the screen here, I have included 2 examples of what research can generate in the context of gambling marketing. So on the left-hand side, you can see my very creative and artistic attempts at a sports jersey. So at the moment, our sports sponsorship is worth €170 million. Now, when it comes to the use of inducements like free bets or money back incentives, research has found that this encourages not only a reduced level of risk for the perceptions of sports bettors, but also an enhanced level of control. In addition, also the dissemination of sexualized content or marketing strategies, such as female models providing free bets or incentives to young men, has been proven as a method of encouraging gambling activities amongst young men. Now, on the right-hand side, you can see a slight difference in the content. Here you can see that we've talked about the re-feminization of gambling. Now, what I mean by that is the ongoing social and personal acceptability for women to be involved with and in gambling activities. Now, research to date has indicated that venues have been marketed as safe, fun, glamorous, and very social. And one of the key messages that women have taken from gambling advertising is that there's significant social benefits that can be derived from participating in gambling, such as getting up and dressed up with your friends. In addition, despite this, perceptions are indicating that it still impacts men more than women. So this naturally leads me on to my next point, which is what about women? Well, globally, this is now recognised as a public health issue. But despite this, a wealth of research to date has focused on men, and as such, women have been underrepresented and under-researched. Now, there's a growing prevalence of gambling addictions amongst women. And although academic research in the last number of years has sought to address some gaps in this research, some gaps still remain in the knowledge that we have around this. So one of the benefits of qualitative inquiry is that we can explore areas that are previously unknown, that are very difficult to represent by statistics or numbers. Here I have an example on the screen, and the next few slides will contain a number of examples from my own research. I have explored the impact of gambling marketing on British and Irish women. And here you can see a quote by Anna, a woman I had the pleasure of speaking with about her experiences. All of the women were asked about their experiences with gambling marketing, and one of the themes that arose was the inescapability and saturation of gambling in our society. Just to briefly add before I continue, any names that I've mentioned throughout the presentation have been allocated a pseudonym, and any identifiable information I have also redacted for the participants' privacy and secrecy of the content that they've disclosed to me. Anna has disclosed here, it's difficult because gambling is sort of everywhere. You go into the shop to get a pint of milk, it's there, it's advertised. If there's some shops will advertise the actual scratch card win, that's plastered everywhere. You can't go down the road without coming across a bookies, which is advertisement. You can even open the paper and get it. Text messages is another one as well. Again, then you can see a quote here from Lisa, who has spoken about the ongoing impact of marketing strategies. She has highlighted a number of experiences that she's had, both with print advertising, radio, and physical and virtual inducements. Lisa explains, around Cheltenham, it's plastered in front of every paper. When you go into the shop, it's all over the papers. Free bets, it's on the radio. Like they always have offers, sign up and you get free €20. So that would invite you to sign up to Paddy Power. Then they'd maybe invite you to sign up to Ladbrokes for another offer. You know, they're constantly giving different kinds of things. It's the same as the slots. If you Google them, it was set up an account with us and you get 50 free spins. So you could just be like setting up your 3 or 4 different accounts just to get your 50 free spins. It's evident that we would struggle to get this kind of insight or depth and understanding of experts by experiences, lived realities, if we were to try and represent this through quantification. And this is one of the many benefits that comes with qualitative research in the context of addictions. Again, then, all of the women were also asked about their experiences with responsible gambling messages. For those unaware, responsible gambling messages refer to statements like when the funds stop, gamble responsibly and gamble aware. Here we can see that Kim has spoken about her thoughts about responsible gambling messages. She explains it's just so like condescending. If you've got someone who's in that compulsive behavior, they're not going to gamble responsibly. They're not going to put a limit on their account. They're not going to set timeouts and all of that. They're not going to do it. And they're already too far gone in that, you know, they're never going to put money limit on their account, because I know that once that limit's hit, they know that they're not going to be able to do it. And so it's irresponsible. The way it needs to be, you know, the whole system needs to be seen differently. Finally, all of the women that were involved in the study had entered recovery at the time of interview. They were asked to look to the future and to imagine what they would like to see if they could make any changes, if possible, to gambling marketing and the way gambling is in our society. An overwhelming theme was the reduction and removal of gambling marketing completely. Here we can see Michelle, who has spoken about this in more detail. Michelle explained, so if I was in a room with all of them, I would say no more ads, period. So if I was in that room with them, I would say go and spend a week with somebody who's a gambling addict or who's in recovery and see the struggles that they go through on a daily basis, between no sleep, not eating, not drinking water, not looking after themselves, losing their families, being homeless. It's an endless cycle. And if you don't go into recovery, if you don't get help, you'll be in a bad place. I would just like to finish up by saying thank you to everyone who has registered to attend today. I have had such a good and enjoyable week preparing for this seminar, and I very much am looking forward to the international panel that we'll have after. Thank you for taking the time to listen, and I'll be happy to answer any questions at the end.
Okay, Erin, thank you very much for that presentation, and it's great to see the research progressing so well, but yes, sad to see the stories of those experiencing harm. So yeah, it's some very important work you're doing, and doing really well in this context, developing better understandings as well. So you can see the chat comments coming through there. So that's great. Thanks very much. Well, thanks everyone for that, and feel free to ask questions and answers in the question box at the moment. I will make sure they go to Erin once we start the full Q&A at the end, if we have time for that. If we can fit them into discussion as it's progressing now, then I'll fit them in also. So feel free. Well, now everyone, thank you very much. I'd like to throw over to our guest panel who have made introductions before, and what I'm going to do is ask some broad questions, and the panel's going to respond to those, and then we will develop questions as we go. So feel free to add your own as it develops. So can I ask Professor Thomas, first question, Samantha, really this idea that critical qualitative inquiry underpins much of the research that you lead. Can you start off by explaining what do we mean by the term in the context of gambling and gambling harm?
Yeah, it's a great question. And good morning, everyone from Melbourne. I guess, one of the things that struck me when I first started working in the gambling field was the amount of research that was focused on what we call responsible gambling. So research that was very much focused on the problems with the individual and how they interacted with gambling, how we could improve informed choice for individuals, and the range of strategies, mainly that the gambling industry was putting in place and the government was putting in place in terms of public education campaigns to try and get people to be more responsible with their behaviours. And really, we haven't seen a huge amount of difference from government and industry in terms of that big dominant discourse around gambling. What we do in critical qualitative inquiry is we kind of flip this discussion on its head a little. So instead of placing all the responsibility at the feet of the individual, we actually look at the broader structures that may be creating the harm associated with a range of different gambling products. So, for example, one of the things that we do in critical qualitative inquiry is we look at power structures. And for us, the key vector of gambling harm is the gambling industry and the power of governments and regulatory bodies to actually start to place boundaries around that industry so that we can actually create safer products within our community. So not placing the blame or the burden at the feet of individuals, but actually starting to demand much more accountability of the government to start to regulate a very, very powerful industry. So the other thing I guess that we do in critical qualitative inquiry is we actually are looking at how we can influence and inform decision-making around gambling. So we are advocates in the work that we do. We take very much a social justice perspective on gambling. We look at this in terms of this being an issue associated with an unjust system, big power imbalances, and we look at the mechanisms that we need to implement to try and fix or solve some of those imbalances. And we do that through talking to people and understanding their perspectives from lived experience.
That's great. Thank you, Samantha. It really sets the scene for what we're looking for today, because I know, knowing that the panel, we all have sort of experience that might fit in around that. So I'm actually going to throw to Dr. Crystal Fulton, and just a question on, in the context of your research, which I think really interesting for those that maybe have not read it. It focuses on not just the person experiencing gambling harm, but those close to those people, that sort of family or small social unit. In what way did the sort of qualitative approaches allow you to understand their experiences and critique their experiences?
So thanks very much for having me today, and thanks for the question, Paul. For us, in the study work that we've done, talking to people was critical. First of all, you can't get the story until you talk to the people. The numbers only tell a part of it. So talking to people was critical. Second, we wanted a whole picture of what was going on with a person, and you can't get that unless you talk to more than one person. And so what we did was we talked to family. And so we talked to the children, the adult children of recovering gamblers. We talked to their moms and dads. These are all people who have a huge stake in that person's life that's really kind of spiraled out of control. And as a result, their lives were spiraling out of control. I met with wives who wished that they'd never heard of gambling and that their partners had never heard of gambling. Their marriages were destroyed. I spoke to one woman who was a gambler, and somehow for years and years, her marriage survived. But they worked through it together. They were so strong and initiated their own gambling help organization to help others. And so that kind of feeling that they had to give back to others as well. So that whole kind of talking to people is just so central, and you don't get the whole picture unless you talk to more than one person. And talking to family is really, really important. That's where you hear about what's going on in the background. You get the full story. You understand what happened on this day, and and then what happened to them as a family as a result. And it's tragic, and yet it's powerful.
Well, thank you, Chris. That's great. important to get those sort of stories. And as you're right, it's that contradiction between the misery sometimes of the situation, but of course the maybe the positive steps that come from that. And Barry, thanks for being here again. Your role as a counsellor means you're obviously listening to a number of sort of experiences and of those experiencing gambling harm. Are there sort of qualitative stories that stick in the mind? Are these stories similar over time, or is there some regression where maybe the stories that you're hearing now are maybe worse than we've seen in the past? Is that something you've experienced, you've heard in your discussions?
There certainly are recurring themes. I mean, in terms of, are things worse now? I think maybe things are spiraling out of control more quickly now, maybe kind of a rapid onset of gambling addiction or whatever. I know this thing has many names, so like I don't want to get bogged down in that, but let's say gambling addiction for a shorthand. That's certainly the thing that we saw maybe 6, 9, 12 months into the lockdowns was much younger people, so skewing much younger. Generally our demographic would have been mid to late 30s was when people started seeking help. Now it's kind of early to mid 20s and people who have not been gambling for that long. So previously people might have taken 10 years to hit some sort of a rock bottom, and now they're getting there very, very, very quickly because of all of these kind of external pressures that are there and drivers. But certainly recurring themes that I know the marketing is one of the things we're going to look at today. And I spoke to some of our service users, and there were recurring themes even in the pieces that they sent on, that you could self-exclude from all of the accounts really diligently. Many people have dozens or more accounts, and they'll go through all of them and they'll self-exclude, and still they will get marketing materials from gambling companies who they know they've self-excluded from, some of the big name ones. So not just the really, really dodgy ones that are licensed out in Curacao or whatever. I mean, some of the big name ones, and text messages, direct marketing. So not just the stuff of what it's like to be in recovery and watch a football match where you've got all of the players that have jerseys with gambling logos on them, and there's all the stuff around the hoardings and all the ads on the breaks. It's the direct stuff that is really harmful, and that is a big recurring theme that we would see coming up. Yeah.
Well, great, thanks, Barry. That was really interesting. So those sort of developments, those stories coming through, and James. Look, and I'll say this, I always feel, like I'm putting someone on the spot, James, but James, what we would call James is an expert by experience, as someone who's got a history with gambling harm. And James, in terms of your story, your qualitative story, have you found that has been useful for going back to this idea of speaking to power, speaking to stakeholders, spreading this message or awareness of gambling harm? Is that something you had experience with?
Yeah, I'll just clear something up first. I've had a few comments. I'm not in a prison cell. This is a wallpaper that I stripped 6 weeks ago and have not done. But so don't worry, everybody that's been sending me messages. Yes, I suppose, and my first instinct to that question, I guess, is that we're more than stories. And I'm not just speaking for myself. I speak to many people harmed by gambling, and we're experts by one of our experiences, but we're also experts by lots of other experiences that we've had in our lives as well. And I've had 3 years now of campaigning on the issue of gambling advertising in football, whilst trying to be in recovery from a 12-year gambling disorder, and progress has been slow. I do think that there's been a bit of a perception change, and I think that's because more and more people are being open about what gambling and the normalization of gambling is doing to young people in this country especially, and it shouldn't be any surprise that there's going to be then resistance and people like me and the millions of people harmed by gambling calling for change. And I also think what's happened is we're seeing more and more people break the stigma and break what you would see as, you know, a stereotypical image of a gambler. Well, that doesn't exist anymore, because, you know, I don't feel like I had an addictive personality. I don't feel like I had a flawed mindset, or had any vulnerabilities to it, really. I think that gambling found me. I refer to myself as a child of the 2005 Gambling Act. And what I mean by that was I was at that peak age, 16, 17, when advertising in this country, gambling advertising, was just completely opened. And at 16, 17, I didn't need to know that gambling was a completely innocent, fun leisure activity. Actually, I needed to know it carries an inherent form of risk, and some of the products have really high addiction rates. And yeah, I'm also involved in a few lived experience advisory panels, and yeah, pace is slow, but I do think charities like Gambling with Lives that I work for have done a fantastic job, not just talking about gambling harms, but obviously bringing death to the table. And this is something that affects up 250 to 650 people every year in this country. So yeah, it's hard. And I just want to touch on one thing Barry said as well about the direct marketing. It was only 2 weeks ago, actually, that Sky Bet or Sky Vegas sent self-excluded gamblers 100 free spins during so-called safer gambling week, and I was one of them. And I'm relatively stable in my recovery, but my wife said to me that night, she was angry. She was like, I need this system in place to protect you, and if it's not, what's the point? And I've heard Samantha say this before, it's a policy catastrophe. For that to happen is a catastrophe, and I dread to think of the consequences.
Thank you, James, for that, and Barry and James for bringing the marketing into this sort of conversation. That's where we'll go next. But James, hearing your comments and Barry, some of yours as well, and knowing more of Erin's research than just what was given tonight. I mean, there's a really interesting things around the role of marketing at certain times in the gambling journey, and that's really where we have a lot more sort of attention to get as well. So what I might do also is just open this question to the wider panel. Then is, you know, how does sort of this idea of critical qualitative inquiry critique the role of marketing in gambling? I'll leave it at that. Anyone like to volunteer a first step?
Erin, did you want to go, or I'm happy to start the conversation? So I think there's a bit of a misperception sometimes with qualitative research that we're just looking at single individual experiences. And one of the things that we're trying to do with qualitative research is to look at collective patterns of experience across different population subgroups. So we look for common themes that we start to see emerge in our discussions with individuals. And I think one of the things that I love about the critical qualitative inquiry approach is that we actually are co-producing our data with our research participants. So remember, when we're talking about power structures, academics are also in an incredibly power and privileged position. And so the role of critical qualitative inquiry is to start to, I guess, minimize some of those power structures. So we actually are working with our research participants to find out and to understand what's going on in their lives, what they're seeing. And I think for me, in terms of marketing, particularly when I started working in this in the early days, you know, we don't have systematic ways of monitoring the tactics of the gambling industry like we have with the great work at the University of Bath, for example, around their tobacco tactics monitoring work. And so we really rely on talking to people about their experiences, what they're seeing, what they're receiving from industry. A lot of that flies what we call under the radar. It's below the line in terms of marketing. And so actually talking to people who are gamblers and who are engaged in gambling actually gives us incredible information about some of the strategies and tactics of the gambling industry. So when we're looking at qualitative inquiry, we're not just talking to people, but we're also looking at those same patterns and themes across marketing. So we do a lot of content analysis of gambling marketing strategies, of advertising. We do a lot of critical policy analysis where we're looking at common themes that are starting to emerge in different policies across the world. Remembering now that a lot of gambling companies are multinationals and that we see these same patterns replicating themselves across the world. I think also in terms of thinking about this role of critical qualitative inquiry, where we're also interested in these dominant discourses or frames that come out from government and industry about how we as a public should think about gambling. And that also includes from our broadcasters or our media about how they frame this issue. So again, we come back to the fact that many of the campaigns and the education campaigns that we see from government right the way across the world are still very much focused on individual behaviours rather than giving people critical information about the way that the industry operates and the way that products work. So really we're starting to look at that across a range of different structures within the community and within this industry. So I might throw over to others to see if they have different perspectives.
Please do.
I'm happy to talk about education because Samantha mentioned it there, and I noticed my colleague Barry has brought it up. And so we've created an education program, which with the very grateful help of Samantha and her team at Deakin University. And one of the things that really opened my eyes when I was creating this is actually how there's been a lack of information. And actually what I needed to know at 15, 16 was not just the horror stories of gambling, was not just about responsible gambling initiatives. Actually, what I needed to know was how this industry works and how their products work and what they did to my brain. And we have a module on marketing as well. And one of the key aspects of that is looking at the appeal strategies used. And I think giving young people those critical marketing skills is essential, because the reality is gambling advertising is not going away tomorrow. I would love it if it did, but whilst it is there, children, they shouldn't be on the end of it. They need to know that this is not a safe, innocent activity that they might take part in when they're 18. So yeah, education is really important, but it has to go alongside a change to the regulation and the environment.
And this is where I guess we see this really important mix between what people tell us and then what we see in the marketing. So for example, if we look at a lot of the marketing strategies that come particularly from the online gambling industry, and we see again these replicated all the way across the world, one of the big forms of promotion that we see are what we call risk reducing promotions. So probably these are familiar to everyone, no matter which country you're in, that if you place a bet on something and your team kicks the first goal but goes on to lose the match, the company will give you your money back up to a certain amount, or they'll give you free bets to start you thinking about gambling. I've even seen gambling promotions in some countries which talk about risk-free bets. And when we talk to young people about those types of marketing, what we see is that for young people in particular, they create a perception that gambling has no risk attached to it. Now, as adults, we all inherently know that gambling is a risky activity. Risk lies at the heart of gambling. So when you have a range of messages that sit around young people and they're exposed to these, in their everyday activities, that create a perception that this very adult product has no risk attached to it, that actually really helps inform our thinking about the types of regulatory strategies that may need to sit around those marketing practices. So from a young person's perspective, it's not just making sure that, ads don't feature young people in them or that they don't have cartoons in them, for example, but it's also how young people uptake the messages that they see, even if they're not the direct target of those ads. We see the same with the responsible gambling messages, so on the one hand, we see lots of messages that say bet now, bet now, bet now, or engage, or go to the casino, or buy your lottery ticket every week, set and forget it. And then on the other hand, from government, if we look at the main framing and industry of their harm minimization policies or messages, it's all about and be responsible with that. Take control of that. So there is a real disconnect between the marketing, the commercial marketing, and then the social marketing that we see coming from government about what people should do, inherently with a highly addictive product. And I'm sure Erin will have seen this coming through in her research with women as well.
Yes, yes, definitely. Even particularly around the misconceptions of how women feel that they're viewed by others, in the context of their addictions. So a lot of the women have cited that they've felt that their partners have said that they're selfish, that they're just irresponsible with money, that they've, destroyed their family. And it is incredibly sad to see that, something like gambling has caused so many harms, not only for the individual, but for others. So we really need to try and move away from this, putting the blame on the individual, because realistically, it isn't just the individual's responsibility to move away from this. There are so many cogs to the machine that need to be amended in order to benefit everyone in society.
Indeed, and as I said, knowing that study, there are some really interesting discussions around that. Crystal, would you mind if I refer back to your research, which is a couple of years ago now, but obviously it's quite extensive around the island of Ireland. Did marketing and the impact of marketing come up as a key theme through the study, and what were some of the stories people shared around that?
Yeah, and it did, and it's exactly what both Samantha and Erin have talked about here. And James, your story of getting, excluding and still getting these ads is not unique. I mean, this is what gamblers told us. And interestingly, I said tonight I would tell you more about families. And when I spoke to family members, didn't matter which family member I spoke to, they all recognized the power and the devastation that advertising can cause in this area. And, speaking of gamblers wanting the ads to go away and never come back, family want them to go away as well. Pop-up ads, all the little sly ads that can kind of creep in. You can't, they found their partners couldn't go on the internet anymore. They couldn't watch a game in peace. The national broadcaster in Ireland, shows gambling ads on TV. So there were all of these different ways that the ads were coming at them from different directions. And it's not just one thing, it's so many things. And family felt it acutely. And so it harms more than one person. It's everywhere. And ads were a huge part of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, in the same context, this sort of Irish context, I mean, Barry, I know that you're saying that the idea of particularly not just the marketing in a general sense, but also the marketing when someone is in recovery and the impact that has upon them. And I know that's coming through Erin's research as well. I'm probably, and everyone's, touched on that to an extent. But you had a story from Mary and stuff like that I think would be relevant around this idea of marketing and advertising in recovery.
Okay, yeah, so I'll just briefly speak about that. So Mary, again, obviously, as with Erin's presentation, these are not the real people's names, and there's nothing in here that would identify the individual in question. So I'm just quoting from Mary here. Reached out to some of our service users who are in good recovery just for their thoughts on the impact of marketing on their lives as individuals. So Mary said, for me, gambling advertising at the start of my recovery was very difficult. The ads show the games I used to play, and that brought me back some very negative emotions and fear that I would slip back into that destructive behavior. The ads also gave me cravings to gamble, and while it is easy to change the channel, all the ads are on at the same time, and it seems that there is at least one gambling ad per break on every channel. I suppose Mary there is referring to kind of daytime TV, a lot of the UK channels where it's kind of Foxy Bingo, for just to name but one of many, many, many of these types of ones. Mm-hmm. And for people who are into things like online slots, there are thousands of online slot websites, but the games tend to be repeated across all the different websites. There's only about 4 big slot game companies, so they make the back end for all of these online slot sites. So you get, quite often people, especially who are into online slots, the music or little sound effect that's in the slot is in the ad, and that can be really triggering for somebody. It's this kind of sensory overload. Of course, they're put in the ads for a reason, right? And this is at like 2:00 in the afternoon. This is like the most addictive form of gambling a person could possibly concoct, being broadcast totally unrestricted, no health warnings. And like she's saying, she could flick over to another channel, but all the ad breaks are synced. anyway, and the ad breaks on the other channels are just going to have the same thing. So that is a big issue, and that's just the broadcast advertising. That's the wide net where you just cast it out really wide and see what you catch. That's not even this same person was trying to self-exclude, had self-excluded from a site, was still getting marketing messages from them, was unsubscribing from the emails were still coming through. She was marking them as spam, they were still coming through. She eventually decided she'd try and figure out some way to unsubscribe, but it would have required her to log into the website that she'd self-excluded from just to unsubscribe from the mailing list that she shouldn't have been on in the first place. And this is somebody who's in recovery, in fairly early stage recovery at the time. This is the sort of stuff that people are dealing with. I mean, with other addictive products, short of a heroin dealer dropping bags of heroin through your letterbox, there's no parallel with legal addictive products. Nobody rams alcohol down your throat in the same way, or certainly not the industry itself.
Absolutely. And once again, I'm going to draw back to Erin's research. And Erin, would you like to make a comment on some of the experiences that your interviewees have said around this, marketing everywhere phenomena?
Yeah, definitely. A lot of the women have discussed this kind of inescapability of gambling. So no matter where you go, you can't escape it. It's everywhere. They've explained that if they get into the car to drive somewhere, it's on the radio. If they drive down a street, they'll have bookies or casinos along the sides of the high street. They'll have pop-up advertisements on their phone if they search for something on Google. They'll have push advertisements from apps, for example. They'll also receive emails, phone calls, text messages. One woman was actually sent a bouquet of flowers from a gambling organization to reward her for being such a good customer. So when you look at all of these different strategies that are targeting individuals and particularly women to involve themselves in gambling activities, you can see how, as Barry said, in the early stages of your recovery, it would be incredibly difficult trying to resist those urges to go back online or to go back on unban yourself from any sites or anything that you have done, especially, again, as James has said, being sent emails, further into your recovery. If you had potentially had a weak moment or been quite low during COVID, as many people have, this again was another thing that came through. The women had discussed, they had wobbles where they had been tempted to go back, and they've said, no, I'm going to stay strong. I'm going to log on to my GA meeting and I'm going to talk about how I feel right now. But it's clear that these types of marketing strategies can create significant problems, not for women, but for anyone impacted by the gambling industry.
Can I just add to that, Paul, as well, is that the gambling industry and its lobbyists are quite full of contradictions, because they say in one sense that gambling advertising has no impact, and yet proudly brag about the impact of responsible gambling messages. But it's either one or the other. Either they work or they don't. And I can tell you how hard and insulting it is for me to hear it when I see gambling advertising has no impact on gambling addiction, because without a shadow of a doubt, I know that was my way in. I know that it facilitated my addiction. It incentivized my addiction during the worst of it. And we talk about how hard it is in recovery. A small anecdote of my experience: in the first 6 weeks, I couldn't watch sport, and I love sport. It's basically my life, and I couldn't watch it because of the advertisements. And I think it's unfair what it does to so many people. It ruins that enjoyment. And the final thing I'll just say is how difficult it is to find who is responsible for advertising restrictions and advertising content. You make a complaint to the advertising code authority, and they'll pass it on to the Gambling Commission. The Gambling Commission will say it's the responsibility of the operators. The operators will say it's the responsibility of the broadcasters. And you've got a situation where that they are not capable of creating advertisements that do not appeal to young people. And that's why I would advocate, and we would advocate, for an end to gambling advertising.
No, it's an important point, James, and it's one well made from some of your experiences. And this is maybe a question for the wider panel again. Obviously, we've got the stories of the issues around marketing in recovery and marketing as part of their addiction. But, Samantha, as you indicate at the start, trying to flip the discussion on its head. Are we hearing anything about people critiquing, the average person critiquing the industry involvement with these, the marketing approaches? It is not just I see it everywhere, but, this is having an impact.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I guess it brings us back to that kind of public health prevention approach, which is trying to stop the harm from happening in the first place. I saw during this Safer Gambling Week that's predominantly kind of run by the industry in UK, something from the CEO of the Gambling Commission, where he said gambling is normal, but we need to make sure that harm is not normal. And I thought that was kind of interesting, because everything that we hear from young people in our research says that they acknowledge that gambling has become normal, but they don't agree with that. And I think that that's a really, really important point to make. There was a time, particularly when I was growing up, when smoking was normal. It didn't mean that we just accepted and agreed with it. We actually did something from a public health perspective, and our governments helped as well, in terms of denormalizing a product that was very harmful for our communities. So this idea that we should accept that these products are just normal and we need to kind of get on with it is kind of interesting to me, because when we do research with the community from a whole range of different population subgroups, from children through to parents, through to, gamblers themselves, the vast majority of people agree that this is an industry that needs more regulation, whether we're talking about poker machines in community settings in Australia, whether we're talking about marketing promotions on television or sponsorship during sport, no matter what it is we're talking about, there is a general agreement that we need to do more to regulate a very powerful and potentially harmful industry for our communities. So again, one of the things that we want to try and do, and we try and show through our research, is that actually communities don't agree that gambling should, or some forms of gambling in particular, should be normalized within our communities. And one of the areas that we've seen that in particular is the embedding and the intertwining of gambling with sport. So, you don't have to be a gambler in recovery to be really annoyed by what you're seeing on television. You can be a parent sat down on a Saturday afternoon watching the football, or a Monday night watching the basketball or the NFL or whatever sport you want, because it's everywhere now, to actually be really concerned about the lack of protection that we have for our young people around being exposed to these ads. We did something in tobacco. We recognized that these promotions were potentially harmful for people, and it was one of the great successes of tobacco control that governments actually took a strong stand on marketing. So again, is gambling normal? Has it become normalized? Yes, in many countries we see that it has, or different forms of gambling have. Does that mean that the community accept this? No, it doesn't. And so part of what we're trying to do is to think about how we denormalize the regular engagement and the embedding of these products in our community settings.
Thanks for that. And can I just apologise to everybody? Thank you for the great discussion. I completely lost track of time and realised we've roughly scheduled about 7 minutes left. So what I might do, I'll ask everyone if the panel wanted to follow up on Samantha's comment there, and then I might throw to the wider questions. Sorry, everybody. So engaged I am in what everyone's saying. I lost track of time. So everyone's asking questions aside, thank you. I'll try and get those in now. So thanks, panel, so much for your discussion so far. We've got just a question from Professor Afra Kerr from Maynooth University in Ireland. Just looking for any sort of everyone want to talk about sort of whether or not gambling organisations or gambling operators adapt their marketing for local context, where there's sort of local nuances, if you will, in the marketing of gambling, if that's been seen by anyone.
We definitely see some of that. For example, we see a lot of that around lotteries. So very nationalistic kind of promotions associated with lottery promotions in many countries. Again, we have a lot of research focus on these very kind of high intensity forms of gambling, such as poker machines or online gambling, not so much on those forms of gambling that actually can create or start to create a pathway to gambling, particularly for younger people, so lotteries, scratchies, and so on. So definitely we see that promotions, as we've seen with, you know, other unhealthy commodities, junk food, alcohol, marketers use what we call symbolic consumption to adapt to local environments. So in Australia, you see very blokey advertisements, betting with your mate in a pub. In other countries, you'll see different forms of marketing around other different cultural contexts. And again, I guess this stresses the importance as well, which is part of that power relationship around researchers really thinking about where they get their research funding from, and certainly thinking about the independence of research so that we can actually really critically engage in looking at these industries and their practices.
Thanks very much. Anyone else want to come in with the comments on those? Okay. We've got a couple of questions working around, you know, the marketing of gambling stuff from the audience as well. One would be that obviously there's the situation is that there's a lot of people who don't gamble but see a lot of gambling advertising on a range of sites and are annoyed by that. If somehow there was a ban on gambling marketing, would it make the general population who don't gamble assume that problem gambling is no longer an issue?
Yeah, I saw that in the chat. That was a really interesting question. I suppose we banned the advertising of cigarettes. Do people now think that cigarettes don't give you cancer or heart disease? I don't think so. I could be wrong there, but you know, if you were to draw the parallel, where we've gotten to the point of a total ban on the advertisement of cigarettes, and I, you know, grew up where certainly cigarettes were widely advertised and heavily promoted, and started smoking them at age 11. Like, so you know, I think we can make a move. I don't think it's flipped in the intervening period where we've banned cigarette advertising and now everybody thinks cigarettes are good for you. You know, if that's a parallel, I don't know if you can draw that line, but that'd be my best guess.
Thanks, Barry. I'm going to ask one from Faye Laidler to everyone. It's in the chat box. You can all see it. Do you think it would help progress towards prevention if people with lived experience were given more opportunities to set the research agenda?
Yeah, I mean, James is probably the best place to speak about this, but from our perspective, absolutely. People who are experts by experience should be involved in the decision-making and the policy-making process, right the way through from research through to decisions that are made around, you know, the funding of research and potential research topics. You know, we see an incredible expert by experience movement in mental health, for example. And I guess it's kind of that, you know, nothing about us without us perspective. So for me, involving expert by experience, involvement from everything through to research policy and practice is absolutely essential.
Yeah, not much to add other than I would agree, and that I think it's important to recognise that, as I said at the start, people with lived experience are more than their experiences and can offer more than just that story. And yeah, I would welcome that opportunity, because I think quite often we are unfortunately used for a sob story, and I'd welcome any opportunity.
Yeah, a bit on that as well. I mean, not just the research agenda, but we've got reviews of legislation at the same time in Britain, Ireland, and in Northern Ireland at the very same time. Have being a individual with the experience and involved in a high-profile campaign, has there been any approaches towards you to be involved in any of these sort of processes?
Not as much as I'd like.
Okay.
I mean, there's been a couple of meetings with DCMS, who are leading the review here, and I mean, you know, a half-hour meeting is probably not sufficient, I would say. And I think there was 16,000 responses to the review of the Gambling Act here in the UK. So, I mean, I would say that actually it's the Gambling Act has been a complete failure, and the people that have been affected the most should be the people where the lessons are learned, and we should learn from every death. The 650 people that take their own life every year because of gambling, a lesson should be learned every single time in policy and regulation.
Okay.
I think that's part of addressing the structural issues, which was the point that was raised before, that, you know, this isn't just about the practices of the industry, but also the practices of policymakers and governments in terms of, you know, creating mechanisms and forums to enable people to sit down in front of decision makers and you know, talk about things that would actually be helpful in terms of regulatory change. You know, we see again the lobbying that comes from the industry and the way that they're able to get in front of politicians, but again, much harder for the average person to do that. And I would include young people in that as well. You know, we've seen a great report from the Lancet WHO UNICEF Commission, A Future for the World's Children, which advocates very clearly for increased civic engagement of young people around unhealthy commodity industries such as gambling, junk food, alcohol, and their ability to be engaged in decision makers about health issues that impact them. So I agree with James. You know, there needs to be a lot more discussion about the structural mechanisms that we can create to enable more people to have a say about what is an incredibly important public health issue.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, everyone, for that one as well. I mean, just for those that may not be located around Northern Ireland, but we just had the APG group look into gambling harm, and the vice chair of that group, Philip McGugan, is also an expert by experience, and his story about his gambling journey, you know, it spoke volumes to many people like myself about having someone with that background involved in the inquiry process that hopefully will feed into the policy making process as well. So that's been something to watch here in Northern Ireland to see how that's developed. And they've recently published their report on the 21st. So I'll try and post a link for that in the chat box at the end. We have the final sort of question, and given the time, I'll just sort of do this. But the question originally looked at what the industry could do to make gambling safer. But I think maybe we broaden that out in terms of more of a stakeholder approach, and what could, if you will, Samantha, the powers that be, the powers that be have, what could they do to best enact something that could see a reduction in gambling harm across the community? And I know it's very hard being, we're all in different communities here, but in a general sense, any sort of feeling of that?
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess the principles are the same no matter where we live in the different parts of the world that we live in. But, I would say that there are three things. First of all, this is about government regulation. We have seen too many occasions in which the industry have been tasked with, minimizing harm or self-regulating. And we know that that is a completely ineffective prevention approach. So government needs to regulate strongly and based on the best available evidence. I think the main thing that we can see across the world is strict curbs on marketing. I think that is something that can be, done systematically across the world, and we can definitely learn from each other's examples. And the third thing I would say is that industry must be removed from the research, education, and policymaking table. We need to take a very strong approach to this, as we have taken with tobacco. We would never dream of tobacco industry sitting at the policymaking table or extensively funding education campaigns or research. And we need to take the same approach in gambling. Certainly my university has a policy that says that our researchers are not able to take gambling industry funding. The Public Health Association of Australia has a similar policy. We need to really start to see academics in particular stand up and convince their universities to take this approach as well.
Can I come in on that as well? And hopefully I remember what I was going to say. A feeling I have it, I'm going to forget what I was going to say to elaborate on that point. So I'm actually going to apologise and throw back to anyone else wants to talk about it. Sorry, it was. So sorry, forgive me. are there countries that are leaders from an international perspective in regulation and the involvement of all stakeholders in regulation and research and academics and stakeholders? Yeah. Are there shining lights, or is this a very international phenomenon we're all struggling with?
Everybody else would be able to answer this better than me, but from a football advertising perspective, both Spain and Italy have banned gambling sponsorship. And a few other European countries are making moves in that direction as well. So, yeah, but the others will know better than me on the rest.
Of course. Thanks, James. Cheers.
I think different countries have done slightly different things. New Zealand certainly has a great public health approach to gambling harm prevention, but obviously still has poker machines in its community. So I think there are little shining lights across the world, but no one country, I think, has taken a comprehensive public health approach to really starting to address what we say is this policy catastrophe around gambling internationally.
Thank you.
Yeah. Sorry, just on that one, Paul. I mean, Germany, now this is kind of early stage because it's still being proposed, and I suppose it has to be rolled out across the federal system that they have there, but they're talking about setting mandatory monthly spending limits. They're talking about reducing the speed of play of things like online slots, and I suppose kind of taking much more of an interventionist approach, but I mean, it hasn't been rolled out by a long shot. I don't think there is a shining light yet. Certainly New Zealand, in terms of the fact that they produce gambling harm prevention strategy every 3 years, and their funding system for funding of services through the levy is very well thought out. I think that there are elements there, but yeah, I've worked in bars in New Zealand, and there are people hooked up to pokie machines for long periods of time, losing astronomical amounts of money. So, there are issues there. I mean, even in the Republic of Ireland, where we're one of the worst case scenarios on the planet, in that we have liberalised gambling and zero regulation, we don't actually allow gambling products in venues that sell alcohol. Touch wood so far. But yeah, I mean, maybe the German thing is gonna improve things slightly, in that it's gonna put it up to some of the big operators to say, look, there are going to be mandatory spending limits. We're going to reduce the speed of play. We're going to put some other public health interventions there.
Great, thanks, Barry. Well, what about your way of sort of bringing our discussions to a close? Hopefully I've managed them okay. But really just that final way that for those not in the UK, you may not know that, but when the fun stops is usually the industry approach to making people aware of their gambling, but it has just been replaced by the idea of take time to think. What are the views of people around these sort of statements, industry generated or even whoever generated, to try and make people more aware of their gambling? What's the key flaws with those sort of approaches?
I'll go first on this one because I'll be quick.
Okay, James.
Utterly redundant, and have been woefully ineffective at reducing gambling harm over the last however many years they've been introduced. I can tell you that I was on the end of these for years, and it didn't help me. I think the industry should take time to think, because it shouldn't be sending self-excluded gamblers inducements to gamble during Safer Gambling Week. So I would get rid of them. The industry themselves say that gambling advertising and messaging isn't effective. So I don't know why these would be either.
Yeah, I guess we just come back to the same principle, which is that industry should have no role in the development of public education campaigns. They need to be independently developed and evaluated, just as we've had with tobacco control. We wouldn't expect the tobacco industry to putting out their own harm prevention or minimisation messages. We shouldn't be expecting the gambling industry to do the same. And for me, again, it's still placing the burden at the feet of the individual. So we really would advocate, based on our research and based on the lessons that we've learned from other areas of public health, that campaigns need to be independently developed, they need to be well funded, and they need to be sustained over time. And industry should not have a role in the development of these big public education campaigns.
I would just to chip in there, I would totally agree with Samantha on this. I didn't have a single person that I spoke to, about their recovery through gambling, from gambling harm through to their parents or their loved ones, and including what they've talked about in terms of employment. There were people who stole from their employers, that kind of thing. So not one of them would have said that was a great slogan. That wouldn't have been what they suggested. They would prefer to get rid of the advertising. So yeah.
Yeah, I agree 100% with everyone so far. Not only is it redundant, it's continues the message that it's all about the consumer behaving responsibly rather than the companies behaving responsibly or government setting responsible policies. So it all keeps everything directed at the consumer, the individual gambler, rather than the other elements of what's going on. So pointless in that it doesn't achieve anything from a so-called responsible gambling perspective, and I suppose counterproductive, although you could argue that maybe it is actually doing what the gambling industry wanted to do, in that it points everything at the individual and directs nothing at them in terms of their behavior and their responsibility.
You're promoting responsible or safer gambling, you're still promoting gambling. So that would be my take on it.
Yeah. Erin, did you have something to
No, completely. I agree with everyone who has spoken so far, and that is something that's come through on my findings so far, that the responsible gambling messages have been wholly ineffective and completely condescending and completely advocate the blame to the individual, when realistically the individual has been impacted by an addiction, and therefore the responsibility should not fall on them, particularly from external environmental impacts such as gambling advertising, and again, responsible gambling advertisements effectively disguised as gambling advertisements.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thanks very much. Thanks very much, everyone. And look, I've tried to sort of just manage discussion this evening and not put in my own points of view. But we had one final question there from Faye Laidler. Do you think the DCMS is the right department to look after gambling? And Faye, my own answer to that is it's possibly, but given the minister responsible for that is in receipt of gambling industry hospitality while a review is being conducted, I would say absolutely not. But I might not throw that one to the panel because they might just all agree with me on that one. So it's not fit for purpose at the moment because of the minister's involvement in the industry. So that's my own personal view. Can I just extend my personal thanks to everyone on the panel? I hope I got to everybody's questions, and hopefully we're trying to type back to people and get things in, and while managing, keeping attention to what the panelists were all saying as well. I hope I did a reasonable job with that. But I do want to thank again everyone for joining us this evening, but also for my panelists to create, I think, hopefully a very decent discussion on critiquing when the fun stops and the contribution of critical qualitative inquiry to this discussion. So thank you very much. And as my colleague Karen Reid sort of mentioned to us, this will be recorded and located on the SRC YouTube channel. So and obviously there will be captions put up on that as well. So if anyone wants to see anything later, they can see it there. But I would say, on behalf of me, feel free to get in touch with me, and I'll let the panel say if they want. Happy to take queries from anyone that's been in attendance today. And we look forward to joining us again in some other event we might be hosting at some stage around this sort of space. So thank you for your participation this morning. Okay, everybody.
Thanks, folks.
Okay, Barry, thank you very much.